Dead America. Tales from New York. The Hospital. By Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0. 7:23 p.m. Felix sat restlessly in the back seat of the taxi, his young frame tense with the weight of responsibility. As the vehicle maneuvered through the Bronx traffic, he anxiously stared at his phone, willing it to ring, his nerves fraying with each passing moment. The taxi driver's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey buddy, I'm sorry to bother you. But do you know what entrance you're going to need for the hospital?" Felix paused, mentally sifting through the information he had about his father's hospitalization, but came up empty-handed. "I'm sorry, I really don't know," he admitted. "It's okay," the taxi driver reassured him. "I've taken a lot of people there over the years. Just tell me what you know, and I'll try and get you close." "Okay, yeah," Felix began, relief flooding through him at the driver's offer of help. "Well, I took my dad to the emergency room around noon, but had to leave to deal with something back at the shop. He's been sick the last couple of days and just keeled over on an oil change. I didn't think it was that serious until that happened. But it must have been something because the hospital said he was being admitted." "I gotcha, brother," the taxi driver nodded understandingly. "It doesn't sound like he was having a heart attack or cancer treatment or anything, so he's probably in the general wing. I'll have you over there in a minute." "Thank you, I really appreciate it," Felix replied gratefully. As the taxi approached the hospital, Felix's phone began to ring. He glanced at the caller ID, then held it up so the driver could see it in the rearview mirror before answering. "Hey sis," he greeted his sister. "What the hell is going on with Dad?" his sister demanded, her voice fraught with worry. "I don't know yet," Felix confessed. "We're about to pull up to the hospital." "Do I need to get on a flight?" his sister asked urgently. "I don't think it's that serious," Felix reassured her, though uncertainty tinged his voice. "You know how Dad is, always overdoes it. I tried to tell him he's not in his 30s anymore, but he doesn't listen." "Yeah, I know, but I just want to be there to help out," his sister sighed. "I know you got to deal with keeping the shop going too." "I'm not worried about that. I can juggle it for a little while," Felix assured her. "Besides, you're down in South Carolina. There probably isn't another flight up here until the morning anyway. So let me get in there, talk to the doc, and find out what's going on with him. And then we can see about getting you up here if we need to." "Yeah, you're right," his sister conceded. "Sir, we're pulling up to the entrance," the taxi driver announced. "Hey sis, we're at the hospital," Felix said. "I'll call you when I know something." "Love you, little bro," his sister said softly. "Love you too, sis," Felix replied. Felix ended the call, tucking his phone away before retrieving his wallet from his pocket. The taxi driver announced the fare. "It's going to be $23.50. With a sinking feeling, Felix realized he only had a $20 bill in his wallet. He held it up apologetically for the driver to see. "I'm so sorry, man. All I have is a 20. I have a card if you can take that." The driver glanced at Felix, then spoke with a hint of curiosity. "You said you and your pops own a shop?" Felix nodded. "Yeah, about a block over from where you picked me up." "I tell you what," the driver offered, "don't worry about the fare. Just cut me a deal on an oil change next week, and we'll call it square." Felix chuckled in relief, extending his hand through the gap between the seats to shake the driver's hand. "You got a deal. My name's Felix. Just ask for me, and I'll hook you up." "I hope that your dad gets to feeling better," the driver remarked sincerely, handing Felix his card. Felix accepted the card with gratitude as he stepped out of the taxi. "I'm on shift until midnight. If you need anything, just give me a shout," the driver added before pulling away. Nodding in acknowledgement, Felix walked towards the hospital entrance, taking in the bustling scene around him. He glanced around, puzzled. Did he drop me off at the emergency room? A nearby man, smoking a cigarette, overheard Felix's question and responded, "Nah, my man, this is the main entrance." Felix surveyed the crowd, noting the unusually high number of people, many of whom appeared ill. "Jesus, is there something going around?" he muttered to himself. "Yeah, and it's nasty stuff," the smoker confirmed. "My wife's a school teacher, and half her class has been out the last couple of days." Fantastic, Felix muttered sarcastically. Hey, I appreciate it, man, he continued before going through the doors. Inside, chaos reigned, with the waiting area overflowing and patients sitting on the floor. This went from 0 to 100 real quick, Felix muttered under his breath. Felix shook his head in disbelief as he took in the overwhelming scene, noting the stark contrast from earlier in the day when he had brought his father in, with only a fraction of the current crowd. Spotting an open window at the information desk, he hastened over, eager to get assistance. Nurse Roberts, a seasoned professional with an air of indifference born from years of hospital work, glanced up as Felix approached. Grab a clipboard and fill it out. We'll be with you when we can, she instructed brusquely, her tone reflecting her exhaustion with the day's chaos. I'm not here to check in. I'm here for a patient, Felix clarified. Nurse Roberts looked up, her expression conveying her weariness. What's their name? Ben Shepherd. I'm his son, Felix replied. After a moment of typing on her keyboard, Nurse Roberts nodded. Okay, here he is. He's in intensive care. Just take the elevators over there up to 6, and one of the nurses up there will be able to help. Intensive care? That can't be right, Felix objected, his mind racing with worry. It's what it says here on the computer, Nurse Roberts stated matter-of-factly. He just has the flu. When I brought him here at noon, he was walking on his own, Felix protested. Honey, I don't know what to tell you, Nurse Roberts sighed. Maybe something went wrong, or maybe there's just too many damn patients and a bed in the ICU was the only one they had available. But I can only tell you what's on my screen, and it's telling me he's up on 6. Felix absorbed her words with a heavy heart before nodding. Thank you for your help. With a sense of trepidation, Felix made his way to the elevator, joining a few medical personnel who were waiting to ascend. As they rode up, he glanced over to the control panel, seeing that there were only 7 floors to the hospital. Well, at least Dad will get a view from the top. He chuckled to himself. Upon reaching the 6th floor, Felix allowed 2 hospital employees to exit before stepping into the more subdued atmosphere of the ICU. Though still busy, it lacked the overwhelming chaos of the lower floors. Can I help you, sir? A nurse named Banks inquired, breaking Felix out of his thoughts. Felix scanned the area, searching for the source of the voice, until his gaze landed on the pretty blonde Nurse Banks stationed at the nurse's station. With an instinctive attempt to charm, he began, "Oh yeah, I'm looking for my father." Nurse Banks, professional and composed, responded, "I can help you with that. I just need his name." Ben Shepherd. He would have been brought up in the last couple of hours, Felix supplied. Nurse Banks tapped away at the keyboard before nodding in confirmation. Okay, I have him right here. It's going to be just a moment, though, before you can see him. Why's that? Felix inquired. Dr. Parks is in with him right now giving him a quick exam, Nurse Banks explained. If you wouldn't mind pointing me over towards his room, because I'd like to ask the doc a few questions, Felix requested. Of course, follow me, Nurse Banks responded, leading the way across the expansive floor, with patient rooms lining the walls and nurses' stations and staging areas scattered throughout. Approaching his father's room, they were met by Dr. Parks exiting. His graying hair and distinguished demeanor belied his age. Dr. Parks, I have the patient's son here, Nurse Banks announced. I'm Felix. What's wrong with my dad? Felix asked anxiously. I'm sorry, son, but I just don't know right now, Dr. Parks replied with a furrowed brow. What can you guess? Because going from walking in here with the flu to the ICU in half a day is a little concerning, Felix pressed. Wait, he walked in here today? Dr. Parks questioned, disbelief evident in his tone. Yeah, around noon. I brought him myself, Felix confirmed. That can't be right, Dr. Parks stated firmly. Why not? Felix demanded. Because that man in there is nearly comatose. He's so weak he can barely raise his head up or speak. Are you sure you're at the right room? Dr. Parks queried, his concern mirroring Felix's growing dread. Felix leaned around Dr. Parks, his heart pounding in his chest as he peered into the room. His father lay on the bed, motionless, while a nurse attended to him, drawing blood. Turning back to Dr. Parks, Felix shook his head, feeling panic rising within him. That's my dad. But it doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry, son, but sometimes with older patients, they can deteriorate quickly. We'll know more when we get some test results, Dr. Parks replied sympathetically, his expression mirroring Felix's concern. Felix fell into a stunned trance as the gravity of the situation sank in. Nurse Banks remained beside him, not wanting to leave him alone. Is there anybody I can call for you? Nurse Banks asked gently, her voice breaking through Felix's daze. I have to call my sister and let her know, Felix stammered. Your cell phone won't work in here, but there's a phone in the room you can use once the nurse is. Nurse Banks began, but her words were cut short by a piercing scream that erupted from the room. Felix snapped out of his trance, his instincts kicking into overdrive as he rushed into the room, his worst fears unfolding before him. His father sat upright, his arms wrapped around the nurse who had been attending to him, his teeth sinking into her neck with a sickening crunch. Dad, what the fuck are you doing? Felix shouted, his voice filled with horror and disbelief. Reacting to Felix's outcry, his father released the nurse, who collapsed onto the bed, grasping at her wounded neck in agony. Nurse Banks rushed to the doorway, her voice echoing with urgency. I need help over here, she yelled. Felix stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest as his father charged towards him with a terrifying speed. Shocked but driven by instinct, Felix retreated a step, shifting to the side and shoving his father in the back as he bolted out of the room. The force of the shove sent his father stumbling forward, his balance lost. In a horrifying moment, the former man now transformed into a monstrous creature tripped over his own feet, hurtling through the air and colliding with the support beam with a sickening crack. Felix winced at the sound, knowing that the impact had snapped his father's neck. As his lifeless body fell to the ground, a heavy silence descended upon the room, broken only by the frantic movements of the medical staff attending to the injured nurse. Nurse Banks pulled Felix out of harm's way as Dr. Parks and his team rushed into the room to assist their colleague. Despite the chaos unfolding around him, Felix's gaze remained fixed on his father's motionless form. Dad, what in the hell did you do? Felix whispered. Chapter 2. Felix stood in a daze, his mind reeling from the surreal and horrifying events that had just unfolded. The image of his father, once gentle and kind, now transformed into a violent and monstrous figure, haunted him. He could hear the frantic activity behind him as the medical staff worked to save their colleague, but his focus remained on the lifeless body of his father on the ground. With a heavy heart, Felix walked over to his father, kneeling beside him and placing a hand on his back. Dad, I don't know what happened to you, but I hope that you're at peace now, he murmured, his voice filled with sorrow and confusion. As he sat there, a subtle movement caught his eye, a faint twitch in his father's jaw. Felix stared at it, his mind struggling to comprehend the implications, but before he could process it fully, a voice cut through the haze. Clear the way. The voice commanded, snapping Felix out of his daze. Nurse Banks rushed over, pulling Felix to his feet and out of the aisle as Bishop and another nurse pushed a gurney through. Bishop, tall and authoritative, strode with purpose, his presence commanding attention. Who is that? Felix asked, his curiosity piqued by Bishop's demeanor. That's Bishop. He's the MedLife pilot, Nurse Banks explained. MedLife? Felix inquired. The helicopter transport. He brings in some of the worst-off patients, Nurse Banks clarified. Felix nodded, absorbing the information as he watched Bishop disappear into a room at the end of the hall with the patient on the gurney. The cacophony of noise from the room in front of him gradually drew his attention back. Is that nurse? Is she? Felix trailed off, unable to finish his question. I don't know. It looked bad, though, Nurse Banks replied solemnly, her expression mirroring Felix's own sense of helplessness and grief. I'm so sorry, I just don't know what. Felix began, his voice trailing off as he struggled to find the right words. Felix's mind raced with a jumble of thoughts and emotions, his words stumbling out incoherently until Nurse Banks gently placed her hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the moment. "It's okay. I know it's not your fault. But I'm still going to have you talk to our security officer," she explained calmly. "Of course. I'll answer whatever questions they have," Felix responded, his voice steadier now with resolve. Moments later, Kenneth, the security guard, approached. He cut an imposing figure with his tall frame and sturdy build, his dark hair giving him a stern demeanor. "What's going on, Banks?" Kenneth inquired. "Patient attacked a nurse," Nurse Banks replied, gesturing towards the scene behind her. "Do I need to have a talk with them?" Kenneth asked, his gaze sweeping over the area until Banks and Felix motioned towards the body on the floor. "Oh, I guess not. Is the nurse okay?" Kenneth said with a shrug. "They're working on her now." "This is Felix, the patient's son," Nurse Banks introduced, prompting Felix to extend his hand for a shake. Kenneth hesitated momentarily before accepting the gesture, his expression softening as Nurse Banks reassured him. "It's okay, Kenneth. He's in just as much shock about what his dad did as we are." "Sorry about that, Felix. We get some real crazies up here who love to have their families back, if you know what I mean," Kenneth said with a nod. Felix offered a small smile, acknowledging Kenneth's words. "It's no problem, Kenneth. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have." "That would be appreciated," Kenneth replied gratefully, leading them to a quieter spot at the nurse's station to continue their conversation. As they walked away, Felix and Nurse Banks exchanged a puzzled glance. However, their attention was soon drawn back to the scene behind them as two nurses approached the body of Felix's father. "He's still alive. I need some help over here," one of the nurses exclaimed, prompting confusion and surprise from Felix and Nurse Banks. "I swear I heard his neck snap, and the way he went down I was sure he was gone," Nurse Banks murmured, her brow furrowed in bewilderment. "We'll let them handle it. Banks, I'm going to need a statement from you too," Kenneth directed. She nodded in agreement with Kenneth's directive and followed him over to the seating area. However, before they could begin their interview, there was a piercing scream echoing from across the room. Without hesitation, Kenneth sprang into action, swiftly retrieving an extending metal weapon from his belt, the only weapon at his disposal. With a sense of urgency, he extended the baton and addressed Banks and Felix. "Both of you stay here," Kenneth instructed firmly. "We're not going anywhere," Banks affirmed. With determined purpose, Kenneth moved towards the source of the disturbance, radio in hand. He quickly relayed the situation to the security office. "This is Kenneth in the ICU. We're going to need police up here," he spoke into the radio, his voice commanding and composed. "Copy that. Making the call now," came the response from the security office. As Kenneth navigated through the nurse's station towards the escalating situation, the sounds of yelling, moaning, and crashing objects grew louder, heightening the sense of urgency. Arriving at the aisle leading to the troubled room, Kenneth noted the sudden silence within, a stark contrast to the cacophony of noise moments before. He glanced towards the room where Bishop had taken his patient, seeing him and the two nurses emerging from within, their expressions tense and alert. "Stay in the room," Kenneth instructed firmly. Bishop nodded, and they retreated silently as Kenneth approached the room, the door shut tight. He pressed his ear against it, straining to catch any sound amidst the faint murmurings. Though indistinct, the noise stirred a sense of unease within him. Taking a deep breath, Kenneth reached for the door handle, pushing it open with caution. Before it could fully swing, a figure lunged out, a zombified version of Dr. Parks, crashing into Kenneth with unexpected force. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs just as three nurses burst through the doorway, their presence adding chaos to the already frenzied scene. Panic erupted among other patients and medical staff nearby, their screams echoing through the corridor. The nurses, their bodies mutilated and smeared with blood, wasted no time in targeting their next victims, sprinting toward them with ravenous intent. Meanwhile, Kenneth grappled with the zombified Dr. Parks, the once familiar face twisted into a grotesque mask of aggression. Struggling beneath the weight, Kenneth managed to gain some leverage, his hand pressing against the undead doctor's chest in a desperate attempt to reason with him. "Doc, it's me," Kenneth pleaded, his voice strained with urgency. calm down." Kenneth's instincts kicked into overdrive as he processed the futility of his attempts to reason with the zombified Dr. Parks. The gaping wound on the doctor's neck was fresh, dripping down onto the security guard. With no other option left, Kenneth shifted into survival mode, knowing it was a fight for his life. As the undead doctor lunged forward, driven by a primal hunger, Kenneth reacted with swift precision. He grasped his metal baton, positioning it horizontally between his teeth to block the impending attack. With both hands, he pushed against the baton, forcing the doctor's head back with a determined effort. Finding an opportunity, Kenneth maneuvered the zombie to the side, seizing the chance to gain the upper hand. With a surge of adrenaline, he straddled the creature, using his full weight to press down on the baton with all his might. The forceful thrust of the baton pierced through the cheeks of the zombie doctor, tearing flesh and shattering bone. Despite the severity of the injury, the creature persisted in its relentless assault, fueled by an insatiable hunger for flesh. As Kenneth maintained his vigil over the doctor, he scanned the scene unfolding around him. The once sterile corridors were now a battleground, teeming with terror and violence. His eyes widened in horror as he witnessed the zombie nurses from the adjacent room descending upon unsuspecting victims, their ravenous hunger driving them to savage attacks. The air was filled with the sickening sounds of flesh tearing and screams of agony as throats were ripped open and bodies fell lifelessly to the ground. But the horror didn't end there. Some of the fallen patients, now reanimated by the insidious bite of the undead, began to stir, their movements sluggish and grotesque as they rose from their makeshift deathbeds. A piercing scream echoed from the elevator, drawing Kenneth's attention as his heart sank at the sight of two more creatures lunging into the confined space, their victims unable to escape the onslaught. The cramped quarters became a frenzied battleground, limbs flailing and desperate cries drowned out by the closing doors, sealing their fate within. "Move, man," Kenneth urged to himself. "If you stay here, you're dead." Kenneth's heart raced as he looked down at the thrashing figure of the doc, the top of his head moving oddly from the damage inflicted. With one final shove, Kenneth sprang to his feet, darting toward the nurse's station. Behind him, the zombified doc rose to pursue him. Glancing over his shoulder, Kenneth saw his unwanted companion and seized a chair, hurling it into the doc's path. With a sigh of relief, he watched as the doc stumbled and fell. Reaching the center of the nurse's station, Kenneth's relief turned to dread as a bloody-gowned zombified patient charged toward him with a guttural moan. Reacting swiftly, Kenneth swung his baton with all his might, connecting with the creature's skull and sending it crashing to the ground. Without pausing to check if it was a fatal blow, Kenneth's sole focus was finding safety. As he scanned his surroundings, a familiar voice pierced the chaos. "Kenneth, over here," Nurse Banks called out. The security guard's attention snapped to his left, catching sight of Nurse Banks and Felix in a patient room, frantically motioning for him to join them. Without hesitation, he dashed towards their refuge. As he closed the distance, two more ghastly figures barreled down the aisle. One aimed straight for him, while the other made a beeline for the door, clawing to gain entry. Kenneth swung his baton once more, but the creature deftly deflected the blow, closing in on him. Acting swiftly, he grabbed the zombie nurse by the shirt and forcefully hurled her past him and into the nurse's station. She collided with a desk, the impact sending her crashing to the ground. Kenneth rushed towards the other creature, its arm wedged through the door where Banks and Felix struggled to keep it shut. Lifting his baton high, he brought it down with all his strength, the sound of cracking bone echoing through the room. Another decisive blow, and the creature went limp. "It's clear. Let me in." Kenneth's urgent plea reverberated through the floor. Banks and Felix eased the pressure on the door, allowing Kenneth to grab the fallen ghoul by the shirt and pull it back before darting inside. As they secured the door, desperate banging echoed from outside as a couple of creatures clamored for entry. "What in the holy hell is going on up here?" Kenneth's voice cut through the tension as he turned towards Banks and Felix, who stood in shock. Moving closer, he placed his hands on their shoulders, his voice softer now. "Banks, I need you with me, girl. What's happening?" I don't know," Kenneth, Nurse Banks stammered, her voice trembling. Another loud thud against the window startled them, prompting Kenneth to hurry and shut the blinds. He glanced at the glass door, shaking his head. They just had to make it fancy, didn't they? Ripping off the bloody sheets from the bed, Kenneth attempted to cover the glass door. Despite his efforts, only 2/3 were shielded. Maybe if we stay out of sight, they'll calm down, he suggested, stepping aside while keeping a wary eye on the creatures at the door. Retrieving his radio, he clicked it on. Dispatch, where are my police? We have a situation on 6. Static filled the room, no response forthcoming. Dispatch, do you copy? Kenneth tried again, but the silence persisted. With a sigh, he tossed the radio onto the bed, taking a seat beside it. Where did your dispatcher go? Nurse Banks asked, her voice edged with concern. I don't know, Banks. We're short-staffed tonight, so they might have had to respond to something, Kenneth replied, his tone heavy with uncertainty. As the banging intensified against the glass, a sense of resignation settled over the room. They knew that if the dispatcher responded, they were likely among the creatures now pounding on the door. Chapter 3. Officers Hopkins and Walters pulled their cruiser into the hospital parking lot, stopping at the side entrance. Walters glanced out at the crowd gathered by the door, shaking his head in disbelief. Damn, Hopkins, take a look at that, he remarked. Hopkins sighed, observing the frantic scene. So many people freaking out over the flu. Just take some meds, chug some chicken noodle soup, and watch daytime TV for a few days. You don't have to clog up the hospital. Walters chuckled at Hopkins' bluntness as he parked the car. They stepped out, continuing their conversation. Damn, Hopkins, don't hold back. Tell me how you really feel. It just annoys the hell out of me, Walters. This happened when my wife was giving birth the second time, people panicking about the common cold. She was having complications, and I nearly lost her because we were having problems getting in the front door, Hopkins explained. All right, I can buy that, Walters conceded. And from the sounds of it, somebody took your approach and started throwing hands. If they were in my position, I doubt I could blame them. Come on, let's go get this nonsense over with, Hopkins said as they headed towards the main waiting room. Stopping at the top of the hallway, they surveyed the chaotic scene below. Hundreds of people crammed into a space meant for half that number. Jesus Christ, will you look at this bullshit? Hopkins exclaimed. Ignoring his partner's frustration, Walters spotted Nurse Roberts at the front desk and motioned for them to join her. He lightly smacked Hopkins on the chest to signal him to follow. Hey Roberts, what do we have tonight? Walters inquired. Nurse Roberts appeared puzzled. What are you talking about, Walters? Dispatch told us there was a patient attack and they needed us, Walters explained. This is the first I'm hearing about it, Nurse Roberts replied, shaking her head. I mean, it's not surprising given the madhouse I'm dealing with here. Hopkins sighed in frustration. Great, it's another wild goose chase. What channel is your security chief on? Walters asked. Roberts consulted a laminated sheet on her desk, tracing her finger along it. It looks like the security chief is on channel 8. The secondary line is 12, she informed Walters. Walters adjusted the radio on his vest and attempted to reach the chief, while Hopkins approached Roberts to continue their conversation. Has it been like this all day? Hopkins inquired. It really started picking up around noon. It's been steady since yesterday afternoon, but today it was like someone sent up a flare to tell people this was the place to be, Roberts explained. If you want to hit the fire alarm and clear them all out, I'll totally cover for you, Hopkins joked. Nurse Roberts chuckled, briefly considering the suggestion before shaking her head. If this keeps up much longer, I just might take you up on that. As Walters returned, he shook his head in frustration. I can't reach him. Hopkins remarked, must be nice to go on break when things are this crazy in here. He's probably responding to something. We're short-staffed tonight, so everybody is pulling double duty, Nurse Roberts explained. I'll see if I can get a hold of anybody on the secondary channel, Walters said as he stepped away, leaving Hopkins and Roberts to continue shooting the breeze. This is Officer Walters, responding to a backup request. Does anybody copy? He radioed. A moment later, Kenneth's panicked voice crackled through the receiver. "Thank God we're up on 6 and we need help immediately," Kenneth exclaimed. "Calm down, buddy. Tell me what's going on," Walters urged, trying to maintain composure. "We're under attack. Everybody has gone crazy and started killing people," Kenneth replied, his voice trembling with fear. Walters felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean they're killing people? What are you talking about?" "Am I stuttering? People are dying on 6. Get your ass up here," Kenneth yelled through the radio. Officer Walters stood firm, his jaw tightening as he resisted the urge to snap back at the security guard for his insolence. There was something in the man's tone, a hint of distress, that gave Walters pause. Before he could formulate a response, the familiar ding of the elevator caught his attention, drawing his gaze to the metal doors. As the elevator opened, Walters' heart skipped a beat at the grisly scene before him. 3 figures, drenched in blood, knelt over a prone body on the floor, tearing at it with frenzied desperation. Instinct kicked in, and Walters reached for his handgun, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You in the elevator, get down on the ground now," he barked. The blood-soaked figures turned towards him at the sound, their moans filled with a twisted excitement as they charged forward, propelled by some unholy hunger. Walters didn't hesitate. With a steady hand, he squeezed the trigger, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing through the waiting room. His aim was true, but the bullets seemed to have little effect, striking the creatures' chests but failing to slow their advance. Officer Hopkins, startled by the sudden eruption of violence, snapped into action. Drawing his own weapon, he turned towards his partner, only to witness the horrifying sight of the 3 monsters colliding with Walters in a blur of motion. The impact sent all 4 figures crashing to the ground, a cacophony of screams and growls filling the air as the creatures tore into flesh with savage abandon. "Walters!" Hopkins shouted. Hopkins dashed forward, his footsteps echoing in the halls as he fired round after round at the ghouls. His bullets found their mark, striking the creatures squarely in the back, but to his dismay, they seemed unaffected. Puzzled and frustrated, Hopkins watched as 2 of the ghouls broke away from his partner, veering off towards the panicked screams emanating from the waiting room. Seizing the opportunity, Hopkins closed the distance to the lone remaining creature feasting on Walters. With a swift motion, he grabbed the creature by the scruff of its blood-soaked shirt, tearing it away from his fallen partner. The ghoul hit the ground with a sickening thud, but its hunger remained unyielding. Hopkins raised his weapon once more, the muzzle flashing as he unloaded a barrage of bullets into the creature's chest. Blood sprayed in all directions, but still, the zombie persisted, scrambling back onto its feet with unnatural speed. Fear and disbelief surged through Hopkins as he recalibrated his aim, his finger tightening on the trigger. With a sharp crack, he fired a single shot, aiming true for the creature's forehead. The ghoul staggered, its movements faltering for a moment before collapsing in a lifeless heap on the floor. Hopkins stood frozen, his breaths ragged, his mind struggling to process the harrowing scene unfolding before him. "Oh shit, Walters," he muttered. Hopkins's heart sank as he knelt beside his fallen partner, his hands hovering uselessly over Walters's mutilated form. The sight was gruesome, Walters's flesh torn and ravaged, his throat a gaping wound that spoke of a merciless attack. But morning would have to wait. The sound of movement from the elevator startled Hopkins back to the grim reality unfolding around him. His gaze snapped towards the source, dread pooling in his gut as he beheld the reanimated corpse that had been devoured moments earlier. Without hesitation, Hopkins raised his weapon, his muscles tensing as he prepared to defend himself. Yet, to his astonishment, the creature didn't advance towards him. Instead, it bolted towards the cacophony of screams emanating from the waiting room, drawn inexorably towards fresh prey. As Hopkins watched in horror, the scene descended into chaos. The confined space of the waiting room had become a death trap, the panicked throng of people offering easy pickings for the ravenous creatures. And to Hopkins's bewilderment, there were far more than the 3 he had encountered earlier. Nearly a dozen now, sporting fresh neck wounds, attacking anyone that was moving. "What in the hell is going on?" Hopkins muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief as he struggled to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before him. Before he could dwell on the question further, a sudden tug at his boot jolted him back to the present. Startled, Hopkins stumbled forward, his gaze snapping downwards to behold the impossible sight before him. "Oh my God! Walters!" he gasped, his voice a mere whisper, as he beheld his once-deceased partner now clawing at his feet with a grotesque hunger. Trembling, Hopkins raised his weapon once more, his hand shaking uncontrollably as he aimed it at the reanimated form of his fallen comrade. "How are you alive?" he choked out. Zombie Walters struggled to his feet, his gaze fixed on Hopkins with an eerie emptiness. In a frenzy, he lurched forward with a guttural moan, prompting Hopkins to react. With a heavy heart, he squeezed the trigger, the gunshot shattering the air as it tore through his former partner's skull. As the echoes of the gunshot faded, Hopkins stood frozen in shock, his mind grappling with what he had just done. He cast a somber glance at Walters's lifeless form, his thoughts swirling in a whirlwind of disbelief and grief. Before he could fully process the horror of the situation, Nurse Roberts and another woman came rushing towards him, panic evident in their voices. "The stairwell. Get into the stairwell," Roberts yelled. Snapping back to reality, Hopkins allowed himself to be propelled forward by Roberts's firm grip, his feet moving on autopilot as they raced towards the safety of the stairwell, just a few yards away from the elevator. Glancing over his shoulder, Hopkins saw the other woman trailing behind them, pursued closely by 4 relentless creatures. Despite the fog of confusion clouding his mind, his instincts kicked into high gear, driving him forward in tandem with the nurse. With urgency propelling them forward, the trio rushed towards the stairwell door, their movements swift and decisive. The nurse wasted no time in yanking the door open, ushering Officer Hopkins inside before following suit. As they pivoted to check on the other woman, they watched helplessly as she was violently tackled from behind, her anguished screams rending the air. Within seconds, she was besieged by a swarm of ravenous creatures, their primal hunger driving them to tear into her flesh with frenzied abandon. Hopkins raised his gun in readiness, but before he could even take aim, the nurse acted decisively, slamming the door shut with a forceful tug. They staggered back from the door as the creatures on the other side pounded against it with ferocious intensity. With tension thick in the air, Hopkins braced himself, gun trained on the door, expecting the creatures to burst through at any moment. Yet, to their astonishment, the door remained closed, holding back the horde. "What the hell was that, Roberts?" Hopkins barked out. "I have no idea, Hopkins." Roberts replied, her voice filled with fear and confusion. "I've never seen anything like that in my life." Hopkins reached for his radio, switching it to the police band, desperate to call for backup. "Dispatch, do you copy?" he called out. Static crackled through the radio, distorting the response, rendering it incomprehensible to Hopkins's ears. "Dispatch, do you copy?" he repeated, frustration creeping into his tone as he received nothing but static in response. "Damn it," Hopkins muttered, his grip tightening on the radio. "It's hard enough getting a signal in the hospital as it is," Roberts interjected, her voice calm despite the situation. "In the stairwell, you're not getting anything but local." Hopkins thought about it for a moment before nodding in agreement. "Wait, what was the backup channel for your security?" he asked Roberts. Roberts paused, furrowing her brow in concentration before responding, "I think it was 12. Without hesitation, Hopkins switched the radio to channel 12. Before he could attempt communication again, a series of loud noises from above sent them both on edge. Hopkins raised his gun, scanning the area for any signs of danger, but the disturbance quickly subsided. Undeterred, Hopkins retrieved a retractable metal baton from his belt, extending it with a swift flick before offering it to Roberts. "Do you think you can use that?" he inquired. Roberts accepted the baton with a determined nod. "I've dealt with the public for the better part of 2 decades, she replied. "I have plenty of aggression to get out." "Good," Hopkins remarked, his gaze steady. "Just aim for the head, because that seems to be their weak spot." With a shared understanding, Hopkins returned to the radio, hoping against hope for a response. "This is Officer Hopkins. Does anybody copy?" Chapter 4. The tension in the stairwell thickened as Hopkins and Roberts waited anxiously for a response, their ears straining for any sign of life beyond the confines of their grim sanctuary. Then, like a beacon of hope cutting through the darkness, a voice crackled through the static of the radio. "There you are. Where did you go?" the voice queried. Confusion clouded Hopkins's features as he listened, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar voice. "I don't know what you're talking about, man," he replied, his voice laced with uncertainty. "You forgot about me already? We were just talking 2 minutes ago," the voice persisted. It took a moment for realization to dawn on Hopkins, a heavy sigh escaping his lips as he pieced together the puzzle. "You must have been talking to my partner, Walters," he explained somberly. "Well, where the hell is he at?" the voice demanded impatiently. "He's dead. His throat ripped out," Hopkins replied. A solemn silence hung in the air before the voice spoke again, its tone sobering. "There's a lot of that going around today," it remarked. Hopkins bristled with anger, his voice rising as he retorted. "Are you kidding me right now, asshole? My partner is dead, and you're making jokes?" But before he could unleash his fury, Roberts' pleading gaze caught his eye, a silent plea for restraint. With a deep breath, Hopkins swallowed his rage and composed himself. "Yeah, fine, you're right," he conceded, his tone begrudging. "We've got bigger things to deal with at the moment." "You're damn right we do," the voice affirmed. Hopkins pressed on. "So what's your name, man?" he inquired. "I'm Kenneth," came the response. "I'm Hopkins," he introduced himself, his voice softer now. "And I've got Nurse Roberts with me here too." There was a flurry of voices on the other end of the line before Kenneth's voice broke through the static. "That's good to hear. I got a civilian and Nurse Banks here with me," Kenneth replied. "Good. So Kenneth, what's your situation?" Officer Hopkins inquired. "We're trapped in a patient room up on 6. There's a couple dozen of those crazies running around up here," Kenneth responded. "Do you have anybody else alive up there?" Hopkins asked urgently. "I'm pretty sure there's another room down the hall that's secure. But other than that, I'm not sure," Kenneth replied. "Okay, well that's a start," Hopkins acknowledged, trying to maintain a sense of calm. "I know that this is stating the obvious, but we need to get the hell out of here," Kenneth asserted. "I hate to break it to you, but going out the front door isn't an option." "It's a feeding frenzy down there," Hopkins replied. Nurse Roberts motioned for Hopkins to extend the radio towards her so she could speak into it. "In fact, we can write off the entire first floor of this building. With as fast as those things are spreading, anywhere we go is going to be covered," she declared with a hint of despair in her voice. "What about using the skywalk to get over to the other building?" Kenneth suggested. "It's where the emergency room is, and it was more packed than our waiting area. So if one of those things got loose in there, it's going to be the same thing," Nurse Roberts explained. "What in the hell are these things anyway?" Hopkins interjected. Kenneth's response was grimly succinct. "I got no clue, man." Nurse Banks hesitated briefly before joining the conversation over the line. "Hey everybody, I have a theory," she announced. Officer Hopkins responded, "By all means, let's hear it." The first one of those people, or things, or whatever we're calling them. The first one was a flu patient. He was nearly comatose 1 second. Then the next he was attacking a nurse, Nurse Banks explained. "So you think the flu that's going around is the cause of all this?" Officer Hopkins inquired. "Look, officer, I'm just a nurse, not an expert on viruses. I'm just telling you what I saw. I have no proof that people with the flu are going to go crazy. I'm just saying that it happened once, and it might be a good idea to plan as if that's the case," Nurse Banks clarified. Hopkins glanced at Roberts, who nodded in agreement. "I'm not mad at that idea, Banks. I concur," Nurse Roberts added. Kenneth interjected, "So where does that leave us? If we can't go out the front door and the other building isn't an option, then what in the hell are we going to do?" "I'm guessing that there's no secret exit? Employee parking or something?" Officer Hopkins speculated. "There is, but it's a couple 100 yards away from the stairwell. So we're in the same position. If we're going for that, then we might as well try and go for the front door, Nurse Roberts explained. A tense silence hung in the air until Hopkins broke it with frustration. Come on, people. There has to be a way out of this place. Think. Yelling isn't going to help Hopkins, Nurse Roberts chided. Felix intervened. What about Bishop? Bishop? Who in the hell is Bishop? Officer Hopkins demanded. Felix, you're brilliant, Nurse Banks exclaimed. Again, who the hell is Bishop? Officer Hopkins pressed. He's the med-life helicopter pilot. I think he's in the patient room at the other side of the floor, Nurse Banks clarified. We have a helicopter and someone to fly it? Officer Hopkins asked in disbelief. I think so, Nurse Banks replied. Okay, we have what we're doing. What floor are you on? Officer Hopkins inquired. We're on 6. If you're in the stairwell by the elevator, be careful when you come up because most of those things are on this side of the floor, Kenneth warned. Gotcha. I'll let you know when we're up there. We might need some help getting in, Officer Hopkins acknowledged. What are you going to do once you're up here? There's a couple dozen of those things around, Kenneth reminded. Well, you got a few minutes to figure that out because we have 6 flights of stairs to climb. I'll let you know when we're in position, Officer Hopkins replied. Copy that, Kenneth responded. What do you say, Roberts? You ready to huff it up some stairs? Officer Hopkins rallied. Hell no. But when do I ever get what I want? Nurse Roberts replied with resignation. That's the spirit. Come on, Officer Hopkins encouraged. The two of them ascended the stairs with urgency, Hopkins bounding up 2 steps at a time, his pace interrupted by Robert's slower ascent. They covered 2 flights without incident, but as they reached the landing for the 3rd floor, a cacophony of noise erupted from above. Reacting swiftly, Hopkins raised his handgun, aiming upward, while Roberts pressed herself against the wall, gripped by fear. The door above them swung open, and 2 figures burst out, shrieking in terror. In hot pursuit, a horde of creatures spilled out from the doorway. As the fleeing pair descended the stairs, their frantic steps tangled, sending them crashing down onto the landing just above Hopkins and Roberts. Before they could rise, several zombies descended upon them, tearing into their flesh with savage hunger. Hopkins hesitated, attempting to line up a shot before firing. But as he prepared to pull the trigger, 3 of the pursuing creatures diverted their attention to them, hurtling down the stairs. Reacting swiftly, Roberts seized the door handle, wrenching it open and darting inside. A strangled cry escaped her lips as she came face to face with a zombie. With adrenaline-fueled strength, she pushed against its grasping arms, her screams echoing in the confined space. Realizing the futility of facing the approaching horde head-on, Hopkins swiftly followed Roberts onto the 3rd floor, slamming the door shut behind them. He yanked the door closed just in time, the creatures outside pounding against it with frustrated fury, their primal instincts thwarted by the barrier. With little time to spare, Hopkins found himself confronted by the immediate danger facing Roberts, who was cornered against a cubicle wall by a relentless zombie, its gnashing teeth mere inches from her flesh. Reacting instinctively, the officer raised his weapon, pressing the gun against the side of the zombie's head and pulling the trigger. In a split second, a portion of its skull exploded, and the creature slumped to the ground lifeless. Before Roberts could express her gratitude, the unmistakable sounds of moaning and shuffling footsteps echoed through the floor, signaling the approach of more threats drawn by the commotion. Acting swiftly, Hopkins seized the nurse's hand, pulling her through the narrow aisles of cubicles and into a nearby nurse's station. With the mob closing in, they huddled low, seeking refuge amidst the cluttered confines of the station. Within moments, a swarm of a dozen creatures flooded into the area, their frenzied movements betraying their desperate search for the source of the disturbance. But the stealthy pair remained undetected, as Hopkins signaled for Roberts to follow. Together, they crept low, navigating the cluttered expanse of the nurse's station with caution. Reaching the other side, they peered out from their cover, surveying the grim scene before them. The vast, mostly open floor was strewn with overturned gurneys and splattered with blood, while large food tray carts stood in neat rows. Using silent hand signals, Hopkins communicated with Roberts, seeking direction. She indicated that another set of stairs lay on the far side of the room, roughly 50 yards away. Hopkins observed several creatures scattered about, preoccupied with their own pursuits, seemingly indifferent to the gunfire. Some thrashed about on overturned carts, while others attempted to breach closed doors. With a nod, Hopkins motioned for Roberts to follow as they emerged from their concealment, cautiously advancing. But their stealth was short-lived, as one of the creatures suddenly caught sight of them, its attention drawn by their movement. A deafening moan pierced the air, heralding the rapid approach of footsteps thundering in their direction. Hopkins refrained from firing his weapon, opting instead to bide his time until the creature drew near. With swift precision, Hopkins stepped forward, delivering a powerful shove to the ghoul's back, leveraging its own momentum against it. The creature stumbled, crashing to the ground and skidding across the floor in a chaotic sprawl. However, the commotion proved to be their undoing as it drew the attention of the other nearby creatures. With chilling synchrony, they all turned towards the duo, their moans echoing ominously in the air. In the tense silence that followed, Hopkins uttered a single word: "Run." Their hearts racing, Hopkins and Roberts sprinted towards the stairwell door, the distance seeming interminable despite being only 40 yards away. Ahead of them, a menacing cluster of half a dozen ghouls advanced. Reacting swiftly, Hopkins aimed his handgun, firing rapidly at head level. While his shots lacked precision, one found its mark, felling a creature and causing two others to stumble over its prone form. As Hopkins attempted to fire again, the dreaded click of an empty chamber filled the air. With no time to reload, he seized a nearby food tray cart, hurling it in the direction of their oncoming assailants. The leading creature charged headlong into the cart, sending it careening off its wheels and crashing to the ground in a tangled heap. Undeterred, Hopkins braced himself, using the cart as a makeshift barrier to plow through the remaining two ghouls blocking their path. But their progress was impeded as one of the creatures seized hold of Hopkins' arm, its grip vice-like and unyielding. In a desperate bid to free himself, Hopkins struggled against the creature's grasp, only to be saved by Roberts' decisive action. With a swift and powerful swing, she brought her metal baton down upon the creature's skull with bone-crushing force, shattering bone and allowing him to break free from its clutches. With the stairwell door within reach, Hopkins and Roberts sprinted towards it, the relentless pursuit of the zombies urging them on. Sensing the imminent danger, Hopkins seized a tall food tray cart, rolling it behind them as they fled. "Get through the door," Hopkins shouted, urgency lacing his voice. Responding swiftly, Roberts dashed through the door, her heart pounding with anxiety as she hoped for safety on the other side. Her silent plea was answered as she found a quiet stairwell awaiting her, offering a temporary respite from the madness. Meanwhile, Hopkins maneuvered the cart into position, its towering presence serving as a barrier against their pursuers. With a stomp of his foot, he engaged the brake, securing the cart in place just on the other side of the frame, before forcefully slamming the door shut. "I don't think that's going to hold them for very long," Roberts remarked. "It doesn't need to. It just needs to hold them long enough for us to get up to 6. Chapter 5. In the stairwell, Hopkins and Roberts struggled to contain their fear as the sounds of the zombies' relentless attempts to breach their makeshift barricade echoed through the door. "We need to let them know we're coming up the other side," Roberts asserted. Nodding in agreement, Hopkins reached for his radio, toggling it on. "Hey Kenneth, do you read me, buddy?" he called out. "Yeah, Hopkins, I'm here. Are you in position?" Kenneth's voice crackled over the radio. "Not yet, we had to take a detour. We're going to be coming up on the other side of the floor," Hopkins explained. "Okay, I don't have eyes on that, but I'll see what I can do," Kenneth replied. "I appreciate it," Hopkins acknowledged before taking a deep breath and straightening up, preparing to continue their ascent. "What do you say, Roberts? Ready to keep going?" he asked, turning to his companion. Exhausted, Roberts could only manage a half-hearted thumbs up in response, eliciting a chuckle from Hopkins as they resumed their climb. Meanwhile, back in their room, Kenneth, Felix, and Nurse Banks huddled together, attempting to stay out of sight from the zombies outside. Concern etched on their faces, they discussed their next course of action. "We need to figure out how to get in touch with Bishop. See if he's even still alive. Because if he's not, then heading up to the roof isn't going to do us much good, Kenneth reasoned. Can we yell at him? He's only about 20 yards down, Felix suggested hopefully. Kenneth shook his head. Good luck with that. I doubt your voice is going to be strong enough to reach down there and be heard over the noise those things are making, he remarked. Felix nodded in agreement, pondering their options. Then what do we do? As they deliberated, Nurse Banks approached the desk beside the bed, her hand hovering over the phone. Please still be connected. Please still be connected, she murmured. Relieved to hear the dial tone, Nurse Banks wasted no time and began dialing, her heart pounding with anticipation. As the phone rang, she held her breath, hoping for a response. A startled voice answered on the other end. Yeah, who's this? The man asked. It's Nurse Banks. Is this Bishop? She inquired urgently. The one and only. Bishop confirmed. Oh, thank God you're okay, Nurse Banks exclaimed with genuine relief. Well, if you can call being trapped in a room by a bunch of lunatics being okay, yeah, sure, I guess. Besides, why do you care if I'm okay? Bishop responded. The entire hospital has been overrun by those things. So if we're getting out of here, you're going to have to fly us out, Nurse Banks explained urgently. The whole hospital is overrun. What are you talking about? Bishop exclaimed in disbelief. We're in contact with a police officer who barely made it out of the first floor. Those things are swarming, Nurse Banks elaborated, her voice tense with urgency. Well, damn. Guess I'm not hitting the clubs tonight, Bishop remarked dryly. Are you alone in the room? Nurse Banks asked. No, I have a patient and 2 nurses, Bishop replied. Is anybody hurt? Nurse Banks inquired, her worry palpable. No, we're all okay, Bishop reassured her. Bishop, this is very important. What is your patient here for? Nurse Banks pressed. What the hell does that matter? Bishop questioned. Just answer the question, Nurse Banks insisted firmly. The dude got messed up pretty bad in a car wreck, his legs barely hanging on. You guys have the best facility in the region when it comes to saving limbs, so he was brought here, Bishop explained. And he's not sick, right? Nurse Banks asked. He's doped up pretty good, so I don't know if he's sick or not. Again, why does that matter? Bishop responded. Because we think the flu that's going around is what's causing those people to go crazy, Nurse Banks revealed. There was a tense silence on the line as Bishop processed this information. Hang on a minute, he finally said. Banks strained to listen, but the background noise made it impossible to discern what was happening. After a tense moment, Bishop's voice returned. Okay, I'm back, he announced. What was that all about? Nurse Banks inquired. I strapped him down to the bed, just to be safe. Of course, I don't think it's going to matter all that much in a few minutes, Bishop explained. What are you talking about? Nurse Banks pressed. Well, honey, whatever those things are, they really want to get in here. And this glass door just isn't up to the task. It's already starting to crack under their weight. And with you calling me up, the phone ringing brought a few more over here too, Bishop elaborated. Can you hold them off? Nurse Banks asked desperately. We're trying to keep the door stable, but if that glass shatters, it's not going to matter, Bishop admitted. Okay, just sit tight, Nurse Banks instructed. Well, what the hell else am I going to do? Bishop retorted in frustration. Setting the phone down, Banks turned to Kenneth and Felix, determination etched on her face. We have to help them, she declared. How in the hell are we doing that? Kenneth questioned, his frustration evident. I don't know, but we need to figure out something because their door isn't going to hold much longer, Banks replied urgently. Kenneth sighed heavily, shaking his head as he moved to the far corner of the room. Carefully inching up one of the blinds, he peered out into the hallway. I don't have the best look, but there's a ton of those things down there, Kenneth reported. How many? Felix inquired anxiously. 10? Maybe more. But it's a moot point. Because I don't know how we're getting out of the room, Kenneth said. We can always call the room next to us, see if we can pull some away, Nurse Banks suggested. If we're going to do that, then why don't we try and call the room next to Bishop? Kenneth proposed. Banks nodded and swiftly dialed the room next to Bishop's. As she listened to the ringing, Felix peered out the window down the aisle, hoping to gauge the effectiveness of their strategy. It's ringing, Banks announced with a hint of hope in her voice. But before the phone could complete its second ring, it was abruptly answered, not by a person, but by the creature inside the room. With a violent thrash, it knocked the phone off the table, drawn to the noise. Banks let out a defeated sigh, gently placing the receiver down. "Did that do any good?" she asked. "I think one of them looked in that direction, but that was about it," Kenneth reported. "Fantastic," Banks muttered sarcastically. "So what do we do now?" Kenneth inquired. "We know what we have to do. We have to get out there and move them away from the door," Felix declared boldly. "Are you crazy?" Kenneth protested. "If you have a better idea, man, I'm all ears. Because none of us matter near as much as he does. If he dies, we all die. So we have to take a chance and get those things away from him before it's too late," Felix reasoned. "What about Officer Hopkins? If he squeezes off a single shot from his gun, that would get them over there, wouldn't it?" Nurse Banks suggested. "There we go. Now you're thinking," Kenneth remarked with a smirk on his face. "Hey Hopkins, do you copy?" Kenneth called out over the radio. "Yeah, Kenneth. But we have a problem," Hopkins replied. "What is it?" Kenneth inquired. "We're at the door, but it's locked," Hopkins revealed. Nurse Banks shook her head in frustration upon hearing this. "Damn it. Our station lead did that yesterday," she lamented. "Why in the hell would you lock an emergency door?" Kenneth questioned incredulously. "Well, it wasn't locked from this side. We had some family members coming up from 5 trying to get us to go down to their floor and help. We kept turning them away at the elevator, so they started up the stairs," Nurse Banks explained. "Fantastic. Are both doors like that?" Kenneth asked, his frustration mounting. "Yeah," Nurse Banks confirmed. Kenneth returned to the radio, letting out a sigh before talking. "Hey Hopkins, we're going to have to get over to it and let you in," Kenneth relayed over the radio. "Don't go doing anything too crazy, Kenneth," Hopkins cautioned. "We got to leave the room anyway, or else our pilot is going to get ripped to shreds." "Stand by and we'll let you know what we're doing," Kenneth responded firmly. "Copy that," Hopkins acknowledged. Kenneth turned to Felix and Nurse Banks, both of whom wore expressions of unease. "So how are we doing this?" Kenneth asked. "If we can get those things away from the door, I'll make a run for Bishop and try to pull those things away," Felix proposed. "And once you do that, then what?" Kenneth inquired. "How do we get up to the roof?" Felix questioned. "There's an elevator at the end of the hall," Nurse Banks answered calmly. "Oh great, an elevator. We're just going to bring more of those things up here from the first floor," Felix remarked with a hint of sarcasm. "No, we won't. It's a direct line from the roof to here. If they're being transported here and not going to the emergency room, they're coming to the ICU," Nurse Banks explained confidently. "Okay, I can work with that," Felix conceded. "But what about the stairwell door?" Kenneth interjected. "I'll take care of that," Nurse Banks declared. Kenneth immediately shook his head at the idea. "No, Banks, you're not doing that. I can do it." "No, Kenneth. You have to stay here," Nurse Banks insisted firmly. "Why?" Kenneth demanded. "2 reasons. 1, you have a radio, so once I'm with the officer, we can coordinate with you. And 2, if Felix can't pull all those things away from the door, then it's going to be on you," Nurse Banks explained. "And when I do get them all away, you can get over there to escort him to the roof, where I'm going to be patiently waiting," Felix added with a confident nod, eliciting a small smile from Nurse Banks. "Okay then, we have ourselves a plan, or at least something resembling one. Do what you need to do because we're going to have to move quickly, Kenneth asserted resolutely. With their plan in place, the three of them braced themselves for the perilous task ahead, knowing that if they weren't successful, none of them were getting out alive. Chapter 6. Felix stood by the door, his nerves coiled tight like springs, while Kenneth lingered beside him, poised to swing the door open. Both men remained concealed from the ghastly figures lurking just beyond. With a solemn gesture, Kenneth passed his baton to Felix. Here, this might help. Remember to aim for the head if they get too close to you, Kenneth advised. I'm hoping it won't come to that, but I appreciate it, Felix replied. Kenneth nodded, his gaze shifting to Banks, who held the phone in her trembling hand. Okay, Banks, let's get this show on the road, Kenneth directed. Banks nodded back, her fingers trembling as she dialed the room a couple of doors down in the opposite direction. The faint sound of the ringing phone drifted to them from their vantage point. In a heartbeat, the remaining creatures outside their door bolted away in response to the distant noise. Felix exchanged a silent nod with Kenneth, signaling his readiness. With a decisive motion, Kenneth swung the door open. Felix darted out, his footsteps echoing across the walkway as he made a beeline for the nurse's station. He hunkered down behind cover, his grip tightening on his weapon as he waited to ensure nothing was coming in his direction. After several tense seconds, Felix felt a wave of relief wash over him as he realized the coast was clear. Moving cautiously, he crept through the nurse's station, his senses on high alert. The cacophony of moans, banging, and shuffling filled the air, keeping his nerves frayed. Midway across the station, his progress was abruptly halted by the sound of movement nearby. With a quick reflex, he pressed his back against the wall, stealing a cautious glance around the corner. There, just off to his left, was a ghastly sight. A young woman, or what remained of her, struggling on the ground. Her mangled legs failed to support her weight, causing her to collapse each time she attempted to rise. Felix retreated behind cover, his mind racing as he weighed his options. Okay, if I time it right, I can slip across while she falls, he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible above the din of the undead. But if I don't time it right and she spots me, one moan and I'm done for. Felix surveyed the open expanse before him, a narrow walkway slicing through the heart of the station, stretching about 5 yards wide. His gaze flicked back to the ghoul, observing its futile attempts to rise, mentally calculating the timing. Yet, with a resigned shake of his head, he acknowledged the impossibility of crossing in time. Accepting that this was happening, Felix tightened his grip on the baton, bracing himself as the creature drew nearer. With each faltering step of the ghoul, he edged closer, biding his time until the moment was ripe. As it stumbled within a few yards of him, collapsing once more, Felix seized the opportunity, slipping out from cover. With a swift, decisive motion, he raised the baton high above his head, bringing it down with force upon the creature's skull. A sharp crack pierced the air, echoing faintly amidst the ambient chaos. Felix remained poised, watching intently to ensure the ghoul lay motionless. Assured of his success, Felix darted across the walkway, his movements swift yet cautious. Taking refuge behind cover once more, he remained on edge, anticipating the arrival of more undead assailants. Yet, to his relief, none emerged. Exhaling a pent-up breath, Felix allowed himself a moment of respite before pressing onward. With measured steps, he traversed the room, finally reaching the opposite wall, where he halted just shy of the end of the nurse's station. Felix carefully poked his head out from cover, watching as a horde of nearly a dozen zombies relentlessly pounded against the door to Bishop's room, their distorted faces twisted in grotesque desperation. They were mere yards away from Felix, who felt a cold wave of fear grip him. His eyes darted around the cluttered desks nearby, searching for anything that could serve as a distraction. Spotting a hefty metal stapler, he snatched it up, testing its weight in his hand to ensure its effectiveness. But before he could hurl it at the encroaching undead, his gaze shifted down the hallway toward the distant elevator leading to the roof, approximately 50 yards away. A sinking feeling settled in the pit of his stomach as he assessed the distance. There is no way in hell you're going to make that run and beat those things there. You got to think of something, he muttered to himself, his voice tinged with desperation. Scanning the hallway frantically, Felix's eyes landed on a potential solution to his predicament. A gurney sat abandoned just off to the side, its occupant still and lifeless. With a nod, he formulated a plan. Okay, get their attention, run like hell, pull that thing in the way, and get to the roof. Nothing to it, Felix muttered. Felix couldn't help but muster a half-hearted smile, knowing deep down that his own bravado couldn't fully mask the fact he didn't believe his own words. He forced himself to shake off the doubts, knowing that time was of the essence, and he needed to act now. With a final glance at the stapler clutched tightly in his hand, Felix steeled himself for what lay ahead. Rising to his feet, he hurled the makeshift distraction towards the floor, just in front of the encroaching horde, while bellowing a challenge. "If you want somebody, come get me." His voice echoed through the floor. Several of the zombies near the door diverted their attention towards Felix, their lifeless eyes fixating on him with predatory intent. With a sinking feeling in his gut, Felix realized his ploy had worked perhaps too well. "Oh shit," he muttered under his breath, his pulse quickening as he sprinted towards the gurney. As he reached the gurney, the relentless creatures closed in, their grotesque forms looming dangerously close. Felix grabbed hold of the back end of the gurney, the weight of the body on it adding to the burden. Straining against the resistance, Felix heaved the gurney sideways, blocking the path of the oncoming horde. Despite the weight, fueled by desperation, he managed to move it just enough to impede their progress. But his triumph was short-lived. As he glanced back, he watched in dismay as two zombies bypassed the obstacle, their relentless advance undeterred. Damn it. Felix's lungs burned as he pushed himself to the limit, the elevator drawing tantalizingly closer with each pounding step. Yet, the pursuit of the undead echoed ominously behind him, their ghastly footfalls growing louder with every passing moment. With the elevator a mere 10 yards away, Felix could almost feel the icy breath of the undead hot on his heels. Panic surged through him as he racked his brain for a solution to his dire predicament. Before he reached the open doors of the elevator, he skidded to a halt, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Whirling around, he swung his baton with all his might, desperation lending strength to his blow. The baton connected with the zombie, but only grazed its shoulder, sending it careening past Felix and crashing to the ground. However, his abrupt stop allowed another zombie to rush past him. With no time to spare, Felix swung the baton once more, aiming for the creature's head. The blow landed, striking the side of its head and shattering its jaw, sending the ghoul reeling off course with a guttural growl of pain. Though not fatal, it did leave the jaw sitting askew on the creature's face. With a swift and precise swing, Felix landed a decisive blow to the back of the zombie's skull, the sickening sound of bone cracking echoing in the narrow space. The creature crumpled to the ground, motionless. But his triumph was short-lived as he heard the scrambling of the first zombie he had knocked down, indicating its imminent return to the fray. Glancing back towards the gurney, Felix saw the majority of the ghouls getting around the obstacle, quickly closing the gap. Without a moment to spare, Felix lunged towards the elevator, attempting to push the approaching zombie back down. Though his efforts barely knocked it off balance, he managed to slip inside the elevator, his heart hammering in his chest. Frantically, he jabbed at the buttons, willing the doors to close and seal off the encroaching horde. But as the doors began to slide shut, the closest zombie surged forward, slipping into the elevator just before the doors sealed. Panic surged through Felix as he swung his weapon at the ghoul, attempting to fend off its advance as the doors sealed shut, separating them from the mob outside. Meanwhile, in their room, Kenneth and Banks watched the chaos unfold below. Kenneth's expression shifted to one of grim satisfaction. "Now we're talking," he murmured. Banks, still tense with worry, inquired, "Are they all gone from down there?" Kenneth shook his head slightly. "No, but there's only one or two left. That door should hold until we get to them." Concern etched on her face, Banks pressed further. "What about the ones who were in front of us?" Kenneth turned his gaze in the opposite direction, nodding in affirmation as he assessed the situation unfolding outside their room. "Looks like the diversion is still working," he remarked. Nurse Banks hesitated for a moment before nodding to herself. "Okay, then I'm up," she declared, though her lack of confidence was palpable to Kenneth. "I can go if you want me to," he offered, sensing her apprehension. But Banks shook her head resolutely. "No, I can do this. Just make sure that cop knows I'm coming." "As soon as you're out the door, I'll make the call," Kenneth assured her. With a deep breath to steady her nerves, Banks positioned herself by the door, exchanging a nod with Kenneth to signal her readiness. As Kenneth cracked the door open, Banks seized the opportunity, darting out and mirroring Felix's actions by taking cover behind the nurse's station. Relief washed over her as the zombies, preoccupied with the ringing telephone, remained oblivious to her presence. Carefully, Banks began making her way towards the stairwell door on the opposite side of the floor, but as she navigated the cluttered space, she stumbled over a chair, making a small racket and drawing the attention of one of the zombies nearby. Kenneth, watching from the safety of the room, couldn't help but shout out a warning. "Run, girl, run." Kenneth's frustration boiled over as his attempt to divert the zombie's attention backfired, only serving to draw more undead towards him. With a curse, he slammed the door shut, securing it firmly before the approaching ghouls could reach him. "Damn it. Come on, girl, you got this," he muttered under his breath, his gaze fixed on the closed door as he silently urged Banks to succeed in her mission. Meanwhile, Banks raced through the nurse's area, her heart racing as the zombie pursued her with frightening speed. With each desperate stride, she pushed herself harder, knowing that the ghoul was getting closer. The distance to safety seemed insurmountable as she darted between rows of desks, the zombie hot on her heels. With the creature closing in, she realized she couldn't outrun it. In a split-second decision, she veered towards an open cubicle. Banks leaped onto a desk, throwing herself over the short wall of the cubicle. The impact jarred her body as she landed hard on the desk on the other side, the force knocking the wind from her lungs. But before she could fully recover, the zombie lunged forward, its cold, clammy hand snaking over the cubicle wall, seizing her arm in a vice-like grip. Suppressing a scream, Banks fought back panic, refusing to draw any more attention to herself. Instead, she frantically struck at the creature's hand, desperate to break free from its grasp. The zombie's strength overwhelmed her, its grip tightening around her arm as it brought her flesh to its ravenous mouth. In mere moments, its teeth sank deep, tearing away a sizable chunk of her forearm. Despite her resolve, a cry escaped her lips, the agony unbearable. Desperately, she scanned her surroundings, her gaze landing on a letter opener lying on the nearby desk. With trembling hands, she seized it, thrusting it toward the undead horror's face. Each jab was a struggle, but determination fueled her strikes, one finally piercing the creature's eye. With a shudder, it released its hold, collapsing to the ground as the sharp implement found its mark, piercing through to its brain. Nurse Banks sank to her knees, tears mingling with the blood trickling from her wound, her gaze fixed on her mangled arm. Despite the pain, she knew she had to press on, for the sake of everyone's survival. Summoning her last reserves of strength, she rose, moving cautiously toward the stairwell door, keeping low to avoid detection. Pausing at the threshold, she stole a glance toward the distant elevator, where Felix had headed moments before. A mix of dread and hope swirled within her as she watched a throng of zombies futilely assaulting the elevator doors. "At least Felix made it to the elevator," she murmured to herself. "I hope he's safe." Banks remained motionless for a fleeting moment, her gaze fixed upon the zombies down the hall. Every nerve in her body pulsed with caution, ensuring the undead were preoccupied with the elevator rather than her own subtle movements. Convinced of their distraction, she summoned her courage. Here goes nothing. Chapter 7. Nurse Banks rose swiftly from her perch at the nurse's station, her movements cautious yet purposeful as she darted across the aisle toward the stairwell door. Pausing just shy of the threshold, she exerted the utmost care, ensuring her actions remained cloaked in silence as she pressed the release mechanism. With almost uncanny speed, Officer Hopkins seized the door, wrenching it open with a grip that spoke of urgency, his firearm at the ready. Yet, upon sighting Banks, his tense posture relaxed, the gun finding its place at his side. Pressing a finger to her lips, Banks motioned for silence as she beckoned them to follow. Stealthily, they advanced, putting distance between themselves and the elevator, their wary gazes scanning the corridor for any sign of danger. As they slipped into the room and drew the blinds, concealing themselves from the creatures outside. Their voices descended to hushed tones. "About time," Officer Hopkins murmured, a hint of relief coloring his words. "I didn't think I was ever getting out of that stairwell." "Sorry, but I had a hell of a time getting over to you," Banks replied. "Well, you made it, so it couldn't have been all that bad," Hopkins retorted. Banks raised her arm, revealing the ominous bite mark etched into her flesh. In an instant, Hopkins's handgun was trained on her, eliciting a startled flinch from the nurse. Yet, before tension could escalate, Nurse Roberts intervened, firmly grasping Hopkins's arm and guiding the weapon downward. "Just what in the hell are you doing, Hopkins?" Roberts demanded. "She's bitten. She's going to be one of those things," Hopkins insisted. "Does she look like one of those things?" Roberts countered. "Not yet," Hopkins conceded reluctantly. "Well, until she does, I need you to settle down," Roberts admonished. After a moment's contemplation, Hopkins relented, nodding in acquiescence as he secured his weapon. Roberts approached Banks with gentle reassurance. "It's okay, Banks. Let me see that arm," she said, her voice infused with warmth and empathy. Reluctantly, Banks extended her arm, offering it up for the other nurse's inspection. With a swift yet thorough assessment, Roberts scrutinized the wound before moving to a nearby cabinet containing a wide variety of basic medical goods. "Come here, Banks. I'll get you cleaned up," Roberts beckoned. Banks complied, stepping closer to Roberts as Hopkins kept vigil at the window, his gaze fixed upon the situation outside. The undead horde amassed around the elevator, continuing to thrash against it, blissfully unaware of the group's presence. "Let me guess, that's where we need to go," Hopkins ventured. "Yeah, it goes up to the helipad. But unless we—" Banks hesitated, her words trailing off as she grappled with the harsh reality of her condition. "I mean you. Unless you get your pilot, you're not going anywhere." "And where is our pilot?" Hopkins inquired. "He's on the opposite corner of the floor. Kenneth has eyes on him," Banks replied. Nodding in acknowledgement, Hopkins reached for his radio. "Kenneth, do you copy?" He transmitted. "I'm here, Hopkins." "Did you make it in?" came Kenneth's voice, crackling with static. "Yeah, but at a cost." "Your nurse got bitten," Hopkins reported. "Is she?" Kenneth's voice trailed off, afraid to finish his thought. "She's alive, but we don't know what those bites do. But for now she's getting patched up," Hopkins relayed, his voice weighted with uncertainty. "That's good at least," Kenneth responded. "Do you have eyes on our pilot?" Hopkins inquired. "Yeah, there's a couple of those things in front of his room, but I can't see the elevator to the roof from here," Kenneth reported. "Well, I can, and it's a shit show. There's a dozen of those things out front," Hopkins grimly observed. "I'm open to suggestions," Kenneth said. "Same here. But let's focus on one problem at a time. We got to take out those two things in front of the pilot. Without him, it doesn't matter about the elevator," Hopkins reasoned. "I can do that right now." "Give me a couple of minutes," Kenneth offered. "Go for it," Hopkins instructed. Releasing the button on the radio, Kenneth turned his attention to the cabinet housing the medical supplies, his hands deftly navigating the array of tools at his disposal. After a moment of rummaging, he retrieved a pair of scissors, their safety tip rendering them unsuitable for his purpose. "Well, that's not going to work now, is it?" Kenneth muttered, his frustration palpable as he assessed the inadequate tool. Undeterred, he positioned the scissors against the bed frame, exerting force until the tip snapped off, leaving behind a makeshift blade with a jagged edge. "There we go. I can work with that," Kenneth declared. Kenneth repeated the process for each of the 3 other pairs of scissors he had, methodically transforming them into makeshift weapons. With a nod of satisfaction, he pocketed the spare pairs, keeping one firmly gripped in his hand, poised for combat. Steeling himself for the perilous task ahead, Kenneth approached the door, his movements cautious yet resolute. Gently easing it open, he peered into the dimly lit corridor, his gaze fixating on the 2 ghouls mere feet away, their attention ensnared by the incessant ringing of a nearby phone. Kenneth contemplated ignoring them, but knew if he made noise or that phone stopped ringing that he could be facing a fight on two fronts, and he would be unlikely to survive that. He stood there for a moment, racking his brain for ideas before coming up with a plan. "Okay, Kenneth, this is either the most brilliant idea you've ever had, or it's the last idea you'll ever have," he muttered under his breath. Kenneth wedged the door open with his foot, creating a narrow aperture through which he could execute his daring gambit. Gripping the metal scissors tightly in his hand, he began tapping them against the glass, the metallic clang reverberating through the corridor and drawing the attention of the two nearby creatures. In a matter of seconds, the undead assailants lurched toward his position, their primal instincts driving them to the source of the noise. Despite their frenzied assault, Kenneth held firm, using the door to hold them in place. With his free hand, he launched a series of frenetic stabs at the creatures, the jagged edge of the scissors ripping up the flesh on their faces. Despite the close-quarters combat and the creature's thrashing limbs making it difficult to aim his blows, Kenneth persisted. Finally, after a harrowing struggle, he delivered a decisive blow, driving the makeshift weapon deep into the eye socket of one of the creatures. As its lifeless form crumpled to the ground, the second ghoul surged forward to take its place. Undeterred, Kenneth resumed his assault, stabbing repeatedly. After a tense exchange, he delivered another fatal blow, the creature collapsing beside its fallen comrade. Breathless and bloodied, Kenneth retrieved the blood-soaked instrument from the eye socket of the vanquished foe, wiping away the excess gore on the fabric of his shirt. "That worked a lot better than I thought it would," he muttered to himself. Stepping into the aisle, Kenneth's focus narrowed on the room where the two creatures persisted in attempting to break down the door. Ignoring the throng of creatures near the elevator, he pushed aside the distraction, honing in on the targets. Moving with deliberate caution, Kenneth traversed the corridor, his steps measured to minimize any telltale sound. It took him a few tense moments to close the distance, but as he approached within 5 yards of the creatures, he readied his pair of scissors, his mind racing with strategies. 2 quick stabs, bam bam, and they're out. But if one hears and turns, you're in trouble. There's got to be a better way, Kenneth mused to himself. Fixating on the frail figure of the patient-turned zombie on the right, Kenneth cracked a smile as an idea formed. "There you go, Kenneth, now you're thinking. Stack them and bag them," he muttered. With silence still his guiding principle, Kenneth pressed forward, his movements swift and calculated. Closing the gap between himself and the smaller ghoul, he seized it by the shoulders with a decisive grip, wrenching it backward with surprising strength. In one fluid motion, Kenneth propelled the undead creature forward, driving it forcefully into the larger ghoul behind it, effectively pinning them both against the glass. With the flailing monsters ensnared in his trap, he unleashed a barrage of stabs with his makeshift weapon. After a tense struggle, both creatures succumbed to Kenneth's onslaught, their lifeless forms slumping to the ground in silent defeat. Stepping forward, Kenneth caught Bishop's eye, prompting the pilot to swiftly open the door and usher him inside. With a swift motion, Bishop secured the door behind them, sealing off the threat outside. "That was a hell of a move there," Bishop remarked. "Yeah, well, I spent all those years going to the gym. Figured I could put it to use for something other than looking good when I hit the club," Kenneth quipped. "We're damn glad you're here." "So what now?" Bishop inquired. "About to find that out," Kenneth replied. Hitting the radio, Kenneth relayed their success to Officer Hopkins. "Hopkins, I got our pilot. We're good to go here," he reported, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that still loomed. "Copy that. Stand by. We're trying to figure out what to do with the elevator situation," came Hopkins's response. Bishop acknowledged Kenneth's update with a nod, but his affirmation was interrupted by the voice of one of the nurses. "I'm sorry, sir, but what do you mean we're all good here?" the nurse inquired. "I mean, as soon as we clear a path to the elevators that we're going to be getting the hell out of here," Kenneth responded, his words carrying a sense of urgency. "Okay, but what about him?" The nurse gestured toward the patient they had airlifted, his condition dire. His leg was encased in a bulky metal contraption, while the rest of his body bore the marks of trauma. Kenneth turned to Bishop, seeking guidance, but the pilot's response was grim. "There's no way to sugarcoat this, so I'm not." "He's fucked," Bishop declared bluntly, his words cutting through the air with brutal honesty. The nurse recoiled at the stark assessment, her shock evident in her expression. Seeking validation, she turned to the older nurse for support, finding solace in the subtle nod of agreement. "We can't just leave him here. He's going to die if we do that," the nurse protested. "I hate to break it to you, sweetheart, but even if this was a normal day, he had a 50-50 chance at living anyway," Bishop retorted, his words devoid of sympathy. The nurse's gaze drifted toward the unconscious patient, her eyes welling with tears. Kenneth intervened, his voice solemn yet resolute. "Bishop's right. We're going to be lucky to get out of here alive. But trying to get him up there too, it's just not going to happen," Kenneth explained. "Not to mention that if this is happening here, it's probably happening all over the city too. And without some major, and I mean major medical intervention, he's not going to make it," Bishop added. The nurse reluctantly nodded in agreement, her resolve crumbling as she was enveloped in the comforting embrace of her colleague. As they shared a moment of solace amidst the turmoil, the radio crackled to life, drawing Kenneth's attention. "Hey Kenneth, do you copy?" Officer Hopkins asked. "Yeah, Hopkins, I'm here." "So, what's the plan?" Kenneth responded. "The plan is that I'm going to try and take those things out. I have 2 mags worth of ammo, so at the very least I should be able to thin them out," Hopkins explained. "I can come out and help," Kenneth offered. "No, you're in charge of the pilot. Make sure he gets up top safely," Hopkins insisted. "You sound like you're going on a suicide run there," Kenneth remarked. Hopkins's laughter filled the air, a brief respite from the tension. "Hell no, I'm not going on a suicide run. I plan on living. And quite frankly, if you take off without me, then you better fly to a different country, because I'm going to hunt your ass down," Hopkins retorted. Kenneth chuckled in response. "Don't worry, officer, we're not going to leave you behind." "Good. How much time do you need to get ready?" Hopkins inquired. "Give me 2 minutes. Let me catch my breath, and then we'll be ready," Kenneth replied. "Copy that. When you hear the gunshots, start moving," Hopkins instructed. "Be safe out there. I'll catch up with you in a few," Kenneth said. The radio fell silent, leaving Kenneth to exchange a glance with Bishop. "Okay, you heard the man. As soon as he starts shooting, we're making a run for the elevator. You are to stay on my ass and you aren't going to take any chances. Are we clear on that?" Kenneth's tone was firm, his eyes locking onto Bishop's. "Preaching to the choir, brother. I'm a lover, not a fighter. And the last thing I'm going to do is put myself in any danger," Bishop affirmed. "Good man. And ladies, I want you to stay close too, because we're flying out of here in just a few minutes." Chapter 8. Officer Hopkins stood resolute by the door of the patient room, methodically inserting a fresh magazine into his handgun. As he checked the weapon, his gaze shifted toward the window, where the elevator and its surrounding throng of zombies loomed ominously. "Okay, walk me through it, just in case I can't make it to the elevator. Is there another way up to the rooftop?" he inquired. "There's a small stairwell off to the side that will take you up," Nurse Roberts offered. "That's no good," Nurse Banks interjected. "Why not?" Roberts inquired, turning her attention to her colleague. "Because it's locked with a keycard lock," Banks explained. "And where's the keycard?" Hopkins pressed. "The floor lead nurse had it, and I have no idea where she was when all this started," Banks admitted. "Is she on the floor?" Hopkins inquired. "Maybe. It was around the meal break time, so she could have been in the cafeteria," Banks speculated. "Fantastic. So it's elevator or bust. What's on the floor above us?" Hopkins queried. "It's our labs. If there are people up there, then there shouldn't be too many of them," Roberts offered. "Should we see if anybody is alive and needs a ride out?" Banks suggested. Hopkins weighed the options carefully, his expression grave. "I hate to be that guy, but we're not stopping to search. Yeah, there could be survivors. There could also be 40 of those things waiting to overwhelm us." "I'm sorry, but not," he declared. The 2 nurses shared a quick glance, nodding, knowing that the officer was right. Okay, Roberts, this is what I want you to do. As soon as you hear gunfire and see those things chasing after me, I want you and Banks to get over to the elevator, Hopkins instructed. You're going to let me come with you. A few minutes ago, you were ready to shoot me in the head, Banks remarked. That was an overreaction on my part. The reality is that we don't know what those bites do to people who don't die. And I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt until you give me a reason otherwise, Hopkins admitted. Banks acknowledged him with a nod of understanding before refocusing on the zombies. Okay, let's do this, Officer Hopkins declared. With a swift movement, Hopkins slipped out the door and into the aisle, his grip tight on his weapon. Stealthily, he maneuvered to the opposite wall, aligning himself parallel to the advancing horde of zombies. Closing the distance until he was a mere 30 yards away, Hopkins prepared to take his shot. While such a distance was easily manageable on the firing range, the presence of flesh-hungry undead altered the dynamics considerably. Taking careful aim, Hopkins singled out his target, a zombie positioned prominently on the outer fringe of the pack. Okay, gang, let's play, he announced before squeezing the trigger. A single shot rang out, finding its mark with deadly accuracy as it struck the side of a zombie's head, sending it crashing to the ground. Instantly, the rest of the horde pivoted, their attention fixated on the source of the gunfire as they surged forward in a frenzied charge. Hopkins unleashed a barrage of shots in rapid succession, a tinge of panic seeping into his movements. Despite his efforts to maintain accuracy, the trembling in his hand proved to be a formidable obstacle. Out of the next 6 shots he fired, only one managed to land a fatal blow to a zombie's skull. Realizing the imminent threat of being overrun, Hopkins pivoted and bolted toward the relative safety of the nurse's station interior. Darting down the central aisle, he paused momentarily to fire off a few more rounds at the approaching mob. Several bullets found their marks, but only one succeeded in striking a zombie's head, while the rest inflicted superficial wounds that failed to impede their advance. Damn it, Hopkins cursed. Hopkins sprinted away, firing his weapon blindly in a desperate bid to keep the encroaching undead at bay. The trigger clicked empty after a few more futile squeezes, leaving him acutely aware of the imminent danger closing in around him. There was no opportunity to reload, no chance for a last stand. Spotting an empty room just ahead, Hopkins dashed towards it, his heart pounding in his chest. Slamming the door shut behind him, he hastily secured it, his hands moving automatically to swap out the spent magazine for a fresh one. Through the glass, he watched as the zombies pressed against the barrier, their grotesque faces contorted in hunger. Well shit. That didn't work, Hopkins muttered under his breath. His gaze shifted to the opposite wall, where Kenneth and the others were making a frantic dash towards the elevators. Well, at least they're getting out, he conceded. Seated in the safety of their room, Roberts and Banks observed the chaos unfolding with growing concern. It took a moment for the gravity of Hopkins' predicament to sink in. Oh my God, he can't get out. We have to do something, Roberts exclaimed. Banks glanced down at her arm, where the zombie bite marred her skin. Despite Hopkins' reassurances earlier, she knew the reality of her situation. You get to the elevator, Banks instructed, her tone resolute as she placed a comforting hand on Roberts' back. I can handle it. You're coming with me, Roberts insisted. We don't know if that bite is going to kill you. We've both seen enough to know how this ends, Banks countered softly. And even if I did survive, I'm not suited for a world like this. I need pajamas, my cats, and trashy television. If this is happening everywhere, then I don't want to be a part of it. Roberts cast a concerned, almost maternal glance towards Banks, her expression heavy with worry. After a moment of contemplation, she acquiesced with a nod. Thank you. And on behalf of Hopkins, thank you, Roberts murmured gratefully before exiting the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor as she raced towards the elevators. Left alone, Banks stood motionless for a moment, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks as she braced herself for what lay ahead. Gathering her resolve, she wiped away the tears, steeling herself for the inevitable. You going off 50 times a night has been the bane of my existence. For once, you're going to work for me, Banks addressed the large pulse monitor in the room. Swiftly, she affixed some of the sensors to herself, activating the device to display her heartbeat on the screen. With deliberate movements, she maneuvered the monitor towards the door, pausing to prop it open before turning her attention to the volume control. "Okay, here we go," Banks muttered to herself. Suppressing another tear, she cranked the volume on the pulse monitor to its maximum setting, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat resonating throughout the floor. With a deep breath, she reached over and forcefully ripped the sensors from her chest. The once constant beat transformed into a piercing, relentless scream as the device registered her flatline, triggering an alarm that reverberated through the corridors. In the room adjacent to the swarm of zombies, Officer Hopkins sat poised, his weapon at the ready, preparing to make his final stand. His attention was abruptly drawn to the deafening cacophony echoing down the hallway. "What in the hell?" he exclaimed in astonishment. Hopkins waited with bated breath as the zombies sprinted away from the door. He paused for a moment, ensuring the coast was clear before cautiously emerging from the room. His gaze flickered up to the swarm of zombies, witnessing their surge into the chamber where the nurse had taken her stand. There was no time for contemplation, only the urgent need to reach the safety of the elevator. Hopkins darted through the nurse's station, swiftly navigating towards the opposite side of the floor. Upon reaching the adjacent wall, he glanced up towards the elevator, relieved to find it still open. Kenneth stood at the threshold, holding the door ajar, while the others clustered inside, the nurses forming a protective barrier around Bishop. With a sense of urgency, Hopkins closed the distance, slipping into the elevator just as Kenneth pressed the button to seal the doors shut, swiftly followed by the command to ascend to the roof. "Glad you made it, man," Kenneth greeted him. "I almost didn't," Hopkins admitted. "We may have trouble on the roof," Kenneth warned, gesturing towards the floor where a dead zombie lay amidst a pool of congealing blood. More bloodstains adorned the elevator doors. Hopkins nodded grimly, his hand instinctively gravitating towards his handgun as he prepared for the unknown threat awaiting them. "I want everybody to stay behind us. We don't know what we're dealing with," he instructed. The nurses and Bishop acknowledged Hopkins' directive with solemn nods. Stepping forward, Hopkins and Kenneth positioned themselves at the forefront of the elevator, poised for whatever awaited them on the roof. The tension in the air was heavy as the elevator ascended, each passing second feeling like an eternity. Their hearts pounded in unison as they anxiously listened to the gears moving, holding their breath until the elevator bypassed the ominous 7th floor. As the elevator doors slid open on the rooftop, they were greeted by the sight of blood staining the pavement, leading a trail towards the waiting helicopter. Hopkins and Kenneth shared a worrying glance before stepping out onto the rooftop with caution. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence, drawing the attention of Felix, who stood at the far end of the walkway, his once human features now twisted by the unmistakable signs of infection. With a guttural moan, the zombified Felix lurched towards them, his intentions clear. Without hesitation, Hopkins steadied his aim, his finger tightening on the trigger as he took careful aim. The gunshot rang out, the bullet finding its mark with deadly precision, tearing through the back of Felix's skull and sending him crumpling to the ground. For a tense moment, they remained on high alert, expecting to be greeted by more creatures. They breathed a sigh of relief when none came. "I think we're clear. Let's get to the helicopter," Kenneth declared. Hopkins acknowledged Bishop's words with a nod as the group hurriedly boarded the helicopter, relief washing over them as they settled into their seats. With practiced ease, Bishop maneuvered the controls, starting up the aircraft and gesturing for Hopkins to don a headset for communication. "I got nearly a full tank of gas, so we can put some distance in. But I gotta know where we're headed," Bishop informed. "How about Block Island?" Hopkins suggested. "Where in the hell is that?" Bishop inquired. "It's a tiny little spot about 10 miles northeast of Montauk. It's a rich-ass place with a private airstrip, and not a lot of people," Hopkins explained. "Sounds like my kind of place." "Yeah, we should be able to get there," Bishop agreed. Hopkins watched as Bishop took off, the helicopter ascending into the night sky, leaving behind the chaos of the city below. As they soared away, Hopkins stole a final glance back at the illuminated Manhattan skyline, its beauty a stark contrast to the turmoil they were leaving behind. A heavy sigh escaped him, mingling with a sense of resignation as he contemplated the possibility that this might be the last time he beheld this magnificent sight. The end.